I've had an idea to do a documentary on Fred DeSarro for close to a decade now. Years ago, when I first started doing a lot of research through trade papers, I remember coming across the issue that highlighted the Fred DeSarro Memorial Race and just seeing a sea of people that were in the grandstands at Thompson for that event. I just thought it spoke to the intensity of the moment, the huge sorrow that the whole community felt. In a lot of ways, it seems similar to what we went through recently with the loss of Teddy Christopher. And it really didn't make sense that Thompson, of all places, where he sustained injuries that he never recovered from. Thompson was the track this guy was dominant at. He had a season where he won 14 out of the 18 races they held. He won 4 straight championships. Freddie did a lot of cool things over his career. He won the Race of Champions. He won the first modified race at New Smyrna Speed Weeks. He won big races against the biggest names. In a lot of ways, he seemed almost kind of like this quiet assassin. He didn't really seem to be braggadocious or cocky, but smart, calculated, clean racer, fast, always good on equipment. And of course in the 70s he was associated with Lenny BOEHLER, which is just an iconic car. In the preliminary stages of this project, talking with the DeSarro family, it was definitely clear we wanted to tell the story of not only who Fred was on the track, but who Fred was off the track. Indeed, he did a lot more than just race stock cars. He was involved in go-kart racing and hydroplane racing. He actually, like his father, got into photography. He was successful in his day job. Meeting the DeSarro family was really truly an honor, and to have them embrace this project, of course, was just remarkable. And I have to admit that the fact that I also got the chance to sit down with Bugsy Stevens for an interview is definitely a check off the old bucket list. You ready?
Okay. Fred DeSarro was born in Providence, Rhode Island on July 3rd of 1937 to Helen and Fred DeSarro. Well, Fred actually had 2 nicknames. Believe it or not, Fred was an altar boy. The kids thought an apt name would be to call him Deacon. And then, of course, different times it got shortened down to Deke. And his other nickname is Fella. When he was little, and at that time he was the only child they had, and he used to go to the beach quite often and stuff. And so many people would remark, oh, what a cute fella he is. Oh, look at that little fella. And just this name kept going, Fella, Fella, Fella. So it stuck when he was real youngster. The family, and especially his mom, called him Fella. In fact, when I was first seeing Fred and going out to the house, I kept hearing about this fella. She kept referring, fella this, and fella did that, and fella did something else, and it was like, who is Fella? I didn't know who she was talking about. I only knew him as Fred. I had to catch up on all the nicknames. They also had 2 other sons, Roger and George.
Fred and Roger both had twin Corvettes.
How I really got to know who Fred DeSarro was at a real young age in high school, through the parade of hot rods before classes started. Fred was one of the kings to look up to.
Fred worked at Bostitch, and it was on the street where I lived. At that time when he was working at Bostitch, he had signed up for the Army Reserve rather than going away and going in for a 2-year stint away. This way, he went up to Camp Drum quite a few times, and he went to Fort Dix in New Jersey. And different things that came up, funeral services for the servicemen and things, in which the reserves, that was part of their duties that they had to take care of. I used to go to the library to do my schoolwork, especially for English things. And I used to see this particular car when I was coming home from the library. It was a beautiful white and turquoise 55 Oldsmobile. Because back in those days, growing up, a lot of the cars were dark. It was just introducing these colors, and I loved turquoise, so that caught my eye.
He had that 88 55 Olds Rocket, and Not only was it a fast car, it was one of the loud cars. And we loved that before school, us kids, you know.
After a while, I started to look at the driver and thought, he doesn't look too bad either. That's how we came about with meeting each other. We caught each other's eye.
Fred started drag racing. He raced at the Charlestown Naval Auxiliary Landing Field in Charlestown, Rhode Island. They had one runway down there. It was 1.5 miles long.
It started out with the drag racing, 55, 56. And then it went on with the boats, 56, 57, 58.
When I first met Fred, he was racing hydroplanes.
First time I ever met him, it was at the Wesley Yacht Club when he was racing boats. Him and his brother George and brother Roger had hydroplanes that they raced.
George did a little better than what Roger did, but Fred, I think, did the best of all of them.
Through that, we met Fred DeSarro, who was in it a year or two already, racing utility outboards.
It was called the utility class, and it was a national association.
We raced APBA racing, which was equivalent of NASCAR, Sanctioned American Powerboat Association. That was in 1956. And we'd practice during the week, and then we'd go off racing the Connecticut River. We'd go to Quincy, Mass, Cape Cod, Wesley Yacht Club, wherever there was sanctioned races.
They would go around to the different rivers and lakes around Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And he was quite adept at it.
And every 4th of July, they had a race at the Wesley Yacht Club. And the father, who I never met him before either, Fred Sr., we went out and set the buoys and stuff, you know, and he introduced me to his boys.
Father Fred, Pops, he built the boats.
He was a mechanical genius. That's where Freddie must have got it from.
All in all, Fred comes across as a quiet guy, but he's got his little things that he does. As you know, they skim, these boats just skim on top of the water, and they send up a rooster tail. And sometimes they can catch a wake the wrong way or whatever, but they can flip over, which he did. He flipped, and at that time he was smoking cigars, and he'd always have one clamped between his teeth. And he flipped one day, and he flipped that thing over, and he come up out of the water, didn't lose that cigar, he still had it clamped between his teeth. And the other thing he would do, because these send up a big spray of water, he'd be coming up fast and come up by the dock where we were scoring and taking, you know, all that kind of stuff, and send up a rooster tail and get us all wet. After several years, the boat club kind of faded out, and nobody, I guess, wanted to really take charge.
I went into service in 59 and lost contact with Fred until 63, but I know during that span, he went go-kart racing.
This energy that he has and his want for competition, he had to find another outlet. So we got into go-kart racing.
I was starting to kind of get serious about racing go-karts. Well, Fred had already been racing go-karts at Davis Kart Track, and he had a pretty hot go-kart.
Then sometime after that, he got into bowling. Same thing, was competitive. I think just that drive to compete, that drive to do good, that drive to win, it's just always there.
And then he somehow or other got into stock cars. And he went with a guy by the name of Bob Ross, Slim Ross. He had this car they called the Bounty Hunter at Waterford.
They needed a driver. You know, Fred was all willing to give it a try. They raced at Waterford in New London. He did so-so, got his feet wet, got to learn some of the ropes about it. I'm sure he crossed over from a lot of things that he learned from racing the hydroplanes. I mean, for the National Association, he won that when he was 15 years old. So he's been doing this type of thing for quite some time.
I first saw Fred run in the 60s when he was running the Bounty Hunter, the 222 at Norwood.
When he had the 222, yeah, he went into the wall. Norwood's wall was all railroad ties. He smacked that pretty good, but he was okay. I mean, any of the things he did, if there was a bang-up, he was always okay.
They didn't really do too much, and Ross ended up running out of money. So Fred was kind of left on a wayside.
That's when he started building his own car. I used to visit him all the time and just watch him building the car. He had a good friend, Ronnie Shawn, helping him, and a couple other guys. And then eventually Freddie McKernan came in and really helped the program out.
Fred McKernan was working on the car with Fred. And it was at some time along in those couple of years that Charlie came in.
I was working in a gas station in Pawcatuck, Connecticut. And I met this guy by the name of Charlie Main, who was the head mechanic for the town of Stonington. And he used to hang out at the gas station. Well, a friend of his told him that Fred needed a couple straight axles for his car, 'cause that's what they used at the time with the funky front end, the straight axle. And this guy, Charlie, had a couple of the old Fords down in his backyard, and they were wrecked anyway, so he took the axles out of them and he gave them to Fred. So then he started going to the races, and then I went with him to Norwood. And that's basically how I met Fred initially and started following him.
He got his own coupe, the Blue 11.
He built the 11, or the 00.
They were his own cars, and they had a real nice operation, and they definitely were low buck kind of guys.
He was in a Sportsman, and he was doing pretty good. One of his arch rivals at Norwood was Johnny Thompson.
Johnny Thompson, he was winning a lot wherever he raced.
I would sneak off to Norwood whenever I could, but I said, this guy's got potential.
Well, he ran that Sportsman 67, 68, so for 69, he built a modified. And he did quite well with it, as a matter of fact.
It was getting to the point of, it was a lot of work, because then he started racing at Stafford and Thompson.
He raced at Stafford on Friday nights, Norwood on Saturday, and Thompson on Sunday when they ran. And once in a while, he'd go to Catamount or Lee.
He was supporting himself enough of what monies he was earning through the racing to support the car, and it was getting to be a lot of work of building the car, having a place for the car, putting the time in of both working on it, because he still worked on it himself even though he had other fellows helping him. And he worked a 40-hour job. He wanted to race and figured it would be easier to race with somebody else. Fred and I dated for quite a few years. And in that time span, he was doing his thing. And I enjoyed it. I went along with it. We went skiing, we were bowling, we were racing, we did all these things. I never thought of saying that, no, you can't do this because we're going to get married, or no, you can't do this, we've got a child. This was part of who he is. That was his makeup. If it wasn't that, it was going to be something else. The only thing I stipulated to him was, if he was going to keep doing it, we had to do it as a family. We had to be all together. Him going off all the time without us, no. So we were always there.
He had made a deal with Linda Reynolds, if they got married, that they were going to do it as a partnership and as a family. And that's pretty unusual in racing.
We got married in '66. I had Gary in '68 and Brian in '70.
After 1969, the cost just got to be so great, he said, he's going to go looking for a ride. Well, during the winter, he was pretty friendly with Joe Brady, and they got together, and they went to Martinsville in the spring of 1970, and Freddie ended up finishing second behind Ray Hendrick. And he ran one or two races up here for Brady, and then Brady ran out of money. Well, about the same time, Leo was in the 15, the wood chopper. Leo and Sonny Casella, there was a breakup between them two. So Sonny, I guess, knew that DeSarro was looking for a ride, and they got together.
1970, when he was running for Casellas, they started running good, so they decided to go run for the championship.
To win a national championship, number one, you have to be great. You have to be determined. You have to have the equipment as well as ability to drive the race car and know the race car. And Sonny Casella provided the equipment, with Dave Torigny building the cars to Zip Zella providing the power.
So yeah, he was for it. We'll try it. And yeah, we spent the year chasing points, and that's a lot of racing.
To win the championship in the 1970s in the modified division meant probably racing at least 100 events a year.
Every race awarded points, but they were cumulative. If you wanted to, you could go 7 days a week at nights, and they had big shows down south.
It was a huge undertaking, and an extraordinary amount of energy was required to be able to run that many races.
That was when they started running Malta on Friday nights, because in 1970 is when Stafford, Jack Rutt wanted the Saturday night sanction because Norwood had closed. So that left Friday nights wide open, so most of the top runners started going to Malta on a Friday night. It's actually Albany, Saratoga, but it's in the village of Malta.
Really be kind of on the top of your game to get those points to stay ahead. Back in that day, it was a lot.
The mode of travel used to be Malta on a Friday night, Stafford on a Saturday night, Sunday afternoon at Thompson. As soon as the feature was over at Thompson, you jump in the truck and haul out to Utica, Rome.
Good thing the New York State Police were kind of lenient and would race up to Utica, Rome and race Sunday night for the points.
Plus, he was working his job the whole time as well.
Yeah, that championship year in 1970, boy, was that exhausting.
We'd come home, be coming up over the New London Bridge on a Monday morning with the sun coming up.
We'd get home Monday mornings, just in time, shower and shave, and we'd go to work at ED, Phil and I, and Freddie would go to Boston. Boy, we had a couple years doing that, racing, chasing for points.
Thankfully, Boston was great enough that they didn't say anything. They were pretty cool in letting him do it. Fred would get out of work, and good old Charlie Main, he would drive us all the way up there, up to Albany, and back again the same night. Charlie was our chauffeur. He was a good guy, and basically an integral part, because with him doing all that driving, that really helped Fred be able to do what he did.
A lot of us in New England were cheering for anybody from New England who might win the national championship. You got these guys from New York, you know, this Evans guy trying to win championships, and a bunch of people from down south, a Hendrick guy trying to win championships. We wanted to see the championship come here, so we were darn pleased to see Freddie DeSarro win it.
Back in those days, the championship banquet was always held in Daytona. I think it's the only time you really felt equal. All divisions, they had the head table, and all divisions sat up on the head table.
Do you remember who was at that table that year?
Tiny Lund, Fred Farmer, I think it was Elder and ourselves. Bobby Isaac was there.
Many of these guys, to win a championship, they had one car or at most two cars. So you wreck one and you're going to have to spend the whole week rebuilding it or build a whole car in a week. It was tough stuff. It really was. Much tougher than now.
Freddie was the 1970 modified champion, and the 3 previous years Bugsy was.
Just tell me about Bugsy.
He was a prankster. But
Any particular prank that you can remember?
he'd always pinch my mom's butt.
Bugsy was a jokester. Bugsy was always kidding around.
I remember once some little old lady came up to Bugsy and she says, I went down and watched you and Freddie down in Langhorne, and that's like a big circle. And he said, how do you know if you're going fast enough? And with a deadpan, straight look at it, he says, ma'am, if your balls aren't rattling, you're not going fast enough. And he said she turned around and left.
Bugsy was a cut-up. Bugsy was the opposite of Fred, actually. I guess you say opposites attract.
Freddie wrapped up the 1970 Modified Championship on Labor Day at Stafford, and he won the 200. But in the meantime, Sonny's father, Jack Casella, he wanted Bugsy in that car.
I just won 3 championships with Lenny, and his wife died.
She died of cancer to his first wife, and he really took it bad.
And without his wife, he became a little different.
His wife passed away. He didn't want to race as much.
Told me, he says, I don't know if I want to race anymore. That was this biggest shock, wow.
So in 70, they ran a somewhat limited schedule, although I think they still won 25 or 28 races. I mean, phenomenal season. They just weren't running all over the countryside anymore. So in 71, Lenny was still, I guess, a little unsure what he wanted to do.
Come springtime, it's time to go to Martinsville again.
Martinsville in the spring, Bugsy still in the BOEHLER car, Freddie in the Casella car.
Freddie started on the outside pole, Ray Hendrick on the pole. The two of them came up and they hit, and did something in the front end.
Freddie crashed and sort of lost his ride from the Casella car. During that week, the Casellas had made a deal with Bugsy to take over his car.
Sonny Casella's father, John Casella, had been kind of eyeballing what was going on between Lenny and Bugsy and offered Bugsy the ride in that car.
Old man Casella called me, and he says, boy, you're going to race for me next year. I says, can't do it. I says, we just won 3 championships in a row.
Bugsy and Lenny were partners in that salvage yard that they had in Sonnet, Mass.
Lenny was going to move away from the salvage operation that he owned with Bugsy, and Casella helped him to do that.
Pop says, I'll give you $500 a week when you race or not. You're coming with me. So I pushed it to Lenny a couple of times and he still wasn't sure. So I agreed to go with John Casella Sr.
But the only problem is that nobody told Freddie. So Freddie marched into Thompson.
The next race was a twin 25 show at Thompson.
Bugsy was there in the 15.
There was Bugsy warming up his car. So Freddie left, just didn't say a word to anybody.
Lenny showed up with the race car, but without a driver. He and Fred had never put anything together that he was going to drive it. I think Lenny probably figured, well, Bugsy's in his car, Freddie'll get in this one and we'll go.
Every driver in the pits was after Lenny to get to drive Old Blue, but Lenny only had one person in mind, and that was Freddie.
So nobody drove the car, he loaded it up and went home.
Bugsy cleaned house, won both races. Well, during the week, Lenny called him. So he agreed to drive the car, the 3 car. So he went down to Lenny's place, he got fitted for the car, whatever.
I think Fred felt that it would be a good partnership. He liked Lenny. He admired Lenny. It was a winning car. They won championships.
The next week was a 100 laps at Martinsville in the spring, the day before the Cup race. Bugsy was driving for Casella. I think that was Freddie's first drive for Lenny. They both did okay there. I don't think either one of them won. But then overnight, it's kind of a legendary story. The two, the Casellas and the BOEHLERs kind of tied up in a hauler race almost all the way back up I-81, coming back from Martinsville, not out of any animosity, just because that's what you do, you play around. They got to Thompson to run the very next afternoon, and there was a twin 25 program there, and I believe Freddie swept them both in Lenny's car.
If you're not really close to it at the time, the swap came as sort of a shock, because both were successful where they were.
I don't think the Casellas and Lenny even saw it personally. Lenny'd been around long enough, as had the Casellas. Race teams break up. That's what they do. Nobody's together forever. It just so happened that when these two teams broke up, instead of looking for other rides, they just swapped. I grew up in Southington, so the guy that all the drivers wanted to emulate in Southington was Eddie Flemke. The mechanic everybody wanted to emulate was from Meriden, which was Bobby Judkins. They were the big car owner / mechanic and the big driver. Well, if you were from Lakeville, Mass, or anywhere east of Seekonk, let's say, you were gonna probably idolize a guy like Lenny BOEHLER.
He was a very quiet guy in my opinion, but he was very, very smart.
He certainly knew his stuff as to how to get the car set up and give it what it needed.
I think he was a mechanical genius, pure and simple. There was nothing mechanical that he could look at and not be able to fix or duplicate it.
Best mechanic I've ever been with, and I've been with some good ones. But he could make things work, nobody would figure it out.
Very smart race car builder, very smart. He was a smart guy, real smart guy. Because he built most of his own engines.
An incredible individual with his intelligence around machinery.
I mean, whoever drove for Lenny BOEHLER was going to do well, but that didn't mean anything more than Lenny picked very good drivers and worked well with them also.
I think he felt that that would be a good move for him. It would be a good fit for him with Lenny. I always thought they were somewhat the same.
Lenny and Freddie were similar.
They were very similar in the fact that they were pretty quiet.
I always thought that Freddie was the perfect driver for Lenny because Fred didn't seek attention other than with his driving. He wasn't a flashy character in the pits, although he was everybody's pal. He minded his own business in the pits, and Lenny wasn't the kind of guy that liked a lot of visitors in his pits.
If you went down to visit Lenny at his shop and he didn't know you, he'd cover everything right up. Everything.
Lenny was a neat guy, a really funny guy, more entertaining than most people would ever think. But at the track, he was all business, and that's why he was there. He didn't want you messing with him.
He was a quiet guy, and kind of, you knew, if he didn't know who you were, you weren't going to get much of a conversation out of anything, maybe a grunt.
Lenny did not like the media at all. I tried desperately to do a Lenny BOEHLER story. I wanted to do a Lenny BOEHLER story so badly, he wouldn't even talk to me.
And Lenny was one of these people too. If he didn't like you, it was forever.
I don't think he saw Phil Smith as media. He didn't see Bruce Cohen as media.
He was real tight with Bruce Cohen.
Bruce was really close to DeSarro and to Lenny.
I mean, he would talk to them guys any day of the week, but some people wouldn't talk to him at all.
I remember one time in Daytona, I went in the stall to talk to him, and he ran on the other side of the car. And whenever I would move, he would move in the opposite direction.
He didn't want to deal with media people or Seymour the Clown or anybody that was around back then, to lighten the mood. He was there to race. And Freddie was as low-key as Lenny in that way.
Most of the time, Lenny was standing around there just kind of stone-faced. Even when his car won, he never really got excited. And Fred was the same way.
Freddie was kind of a quiet guy. He didn't talk to many people too much. He kind of stayed to himself.
You'd walk by and you'd wave to Fred, or you'd nod at him and he'd wave or nod back. And that was your interaction with that whole team. Lenny's crew was a lot like Lenny himself. They stayed to themselves. Back then, Jimmy Fournier, for a long time, was Lenny's right-hand man. Bruce Holbrook was around him quite a bit.
If you got so that you gained his confidence, he would have you doing things and stuff too. But guy was really smart. He knew how to get the most out of everything.
Jack Canavan and Bill Sloboda, they'd go everywhere that Lenny went.
All through my life, Bill Sloboda and I had been best friends. And I got him to go to his first race, but he got friendly with a couple of the BOEHLER crew members. And Bill kind of brought me over to introduce me to the crew guys. All of a sudden, Lenny found out that I was mechanically inclined. I had gone to trade school for auto mechanics. So he knew that he could trust me on a few things.
They were all quiet guys. They kept to themselves, just like Lenny, just like Freddie. But boy, they posed for a lot of victory lane pictures. I mean, those guys won some races.
Well, the idea for the Spring Scissor was because both Lou and I were broke, and neither one of us had enough money to go racing the following year.
Their reason for that race was they had a modified that they ran on dirt at the time, and they needed funding to race that car.
We thought, well, if we could run a race and we somehow or another made some money, I needed a car, Lou needed an engine, and we both needed a truck. So that's what we came up with.
Dick Berger and Lou Boyd and Bruce Cohen started promoting that thing the previous fall.
To their credit, they publicized it so well.
I mean, they were hanging off the rafters, basically.
They drew in a fantastic crowd. They did it perfectly.
We were really lucky in every way with that race.
Lou and I were both worried about the weather. We were just scared to death about the weather.
The forecast was terrible. It was misty, it was cold, it looked like it could rain at any point.
Eddie Flemke was leading it in the original Bob Judkins 2X Pinto, although it had been repainted light blue and was the number 34.
Fred ran well. He ran towards the front.
Freddie was all over Eddie probably with 20 to go, down to about 10 to go.
A couple laps to go, a big cloud going into the first turn, a big cloud of steam come out of that thing.
Something like it was a water pump, Lou?
I believe so,
I think it was
yeah.
the water pump
Yeah.
in Flemke's car.
Eddie was leading the race. I mean, he had the thing won.
And he stuck his arm out the window and just sort of waved. It was a surprise win because certainly Eddie Flemke had that race in hand. He had it won.
And Freddie had a great line that I think speaks volumes to the kind of guy he was. Somebody asked him later, do you think he would have gotten by Eddie? And Freddie said, the only way I would have done that was if he made a mistake, and Eddie Flemke does not make mistakes. And I thought, you know, so many guys won't throw a compliment toward another driver, but that was Freddie. The second year, Eddie won the race, this time in a 2X Pinto owned by Bobby Judkins, and again had a titanic battle with Freddie for the win. Eddie in the Judkins Pinto, Freddie in the BOEHLER Coupe. You know, there's a certain group of those guys, Bugsy, Freddie, Eddie, younger Ronnie Bouchard. They were all so similar in that they were fierce racers, but I never remember any of them ever take an unfair advantage of the other guy to win the race. The bump and run was a death penalty at the time. You just wouldn't do it. Freddie ended up being the track champion at Stafford that year. Freddie had a horrible wreck at Stafford.
He rode over a wheel in the first turn.
He flipped Lenny's coupe clear out of the place in turns 1 and 2.
He got up in the air, which took him high enough to get over the guardrail.
And went right up and over, right about where the pit grandstand is now.
And ended up nearly tumbling down the big embankment.
Car was almost out of sight. It was on its side, I believe.
Back then, there wasn't a lot of catch fence. There wasn't the trees that border the place now. The car was obviously badly bent. It was a violent wreck. Inside the car, you didn't have the head and neck restraints that you have now. The seats were terrible. And yet Freddie popped out of that thing relatively unscathed.
Believe it or not, the only thing that happened to him, he stubbed his toe when he got out.
He hurt his toe because front end kind of crumbled up a little bit, but he hurt his toe. And that was all. That was it.
And that car ran the following week.
Wow, really?
Yeah. All banged up, full of dirt and stones and everything else, but it was there and it was ready to go.
Lenny wasn't into cosmetics, and Lenny never built a beautiful car. I mean, at that time it was okay.
Freddie had gotten in an accident the week before, and the car was pretty dented. It was dented in the roof and other spots. And Lenny primered, banged the dents out, primered the car, and brought it back.
He also knew how to make the promoters angry, Jack Arute in particular, because he didn't keep his car very shiny.
And Arute says, you can't run the car looking like that.
Jack was very much on a professionalism kick then, as was Jack Jr. The two of them thought, we've got to get the image of the modified away from what it had been.
The so-called Pinto Revolution was on, and everybody was coming up with these real classy-looking cars.
Jack would occasionally harp on Lenny to improve the looks of his car.
It was this thing, you can't have primer, you can't have this, you can't have that. They were getting touchy about it, and Lenny was more concerned if that car was going to run and that it was going to win.
And the rivalry Lenny got sick of him harping on him, and finally, he wouldn't go to victory lane when Fred won.
Goes over to Freddie and he says, you win this race, you don't go to victory lane, you pull the car right in. Freddie won the race, pulled the car right into the pits. Arute came over on his go-kart. You got to get that car out there. Well, he says, I'm loading the car up. That was it.
So Jack Arute kind of said, I don't remember what a win paid back then. Let's say it was $800. The purse was $1 to win and $799 for the owner to come to Victory Lane. You know, he actually had this written out somewhere. And it was sort of to get Lenny's goat, but also as a way of saying, we want you out there.
Lenny used to leave that thing outside, purposely. The car and the chassis. Monday morning, that thing would be in the garage, he'd pull the motor out of it, and anything he had to do to the chassis, he'd do it. And then that thing would sit outside all week long, get filthy dirty, covered with pine. There was a lot of pine trees down there. The thing would be full of pine needles. I mean, it's amazing.
For years, Fred would always say, geez, that 3-car never breaks down, son of a gun. When he started driving for him in 71, and after a few weeks of driving for Lenny, he went up to the garage and on a Monday night, and you could see why that car never broke down. Because that car was up on jack stands and every bit of it taken apart. Maintenance being done from wheel bearings to brakes, you name it. Transmissions, it was always checked. And then Lenny would reassemble it for the weekend and actually throw dirt on it and make it look as though it was never touched.
Lenny would do crazy things to throw people off. His cars were nothing fancy, but obviously mechanically they were incredible.
He was a mechanical genius. As far as Lenny was concerned, looks were a prime high on the list. The thing went, and he was trying things all the time, experimenting, and some things were hidden and some things were bogus diversions, like the spark plug with a lead going under the firewall and hiding in there, and people would try to sidle in and get a look at what the hell was going on. And
people would look at that and wouldn't really look at what he was really doing. I mean, that's how smart he was. In fact, he had his so-called ball joint coolers.
Oh yeah, ball joint coolers.
The ball joint coolers, an old Maxwell House coffee can.
Any kind of can, and would kind of tape it to the front A-frame and would tell people it was his ball joint cooler.
Them things did absolutely nothing. Nothing but make people talk.
But all of a sudden, ball joint coolers were the big mystery in New England. It was nothing. It was Lenny being Lenny.
He walked in the pits one night and he's walking in and he kicked the metal. There was a metal hook on the ground. He picked it up, took it back to his hauler, took sandpaper, cleaned it all up, and he welded it on the back. And I went over there and I was talking with him. I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Bugsy, you wait. Next week, there'll be 3 or 4 guys weld that hook on. They think that's going to make me go faster." And he was right. Next week I looked, there was 3 or 4 guys, they welded a hook on the back. He thought that made him go faster.
They're all looking at this and say, what the hell is this guy doing? Is that what's making this thing go the way it is? But they weren't looking whatever else he was doing, you know what I'm saying? He was the master of that. Really the master of that.
I think he got a kick out of getting people stirred.
You know, when you're on top, everybody wants what you got.
I think part of what made them good together, and it's a good team, a good partnership, Fred's experience of building his own car, working on his own car, his own mechanical ability, and his ability of racing and feeling the car, knowing what it was doing, what it was not doing, and that he could convey this to Lenny. And then convey it in a way that Lenny would have an idea, no. So between the two of them, of their knowledge, you melded together, I think made them a terrific team.
He was a heck of a setup guy. He was another Leo Cleary when it came to setting up a car. He knew exactly what the car needed, and he could drive.
He was very conscious of not ruining his equipment. And he would start a race, a big race, and he would go out and run around and just lay back and stroke it. And at the end of the race, people would say, where'd he come from? You know, that was just the type of racer.
Freddie was a good, clean racer.
He didn't usually use you up on the track. He gave you room to race and raced you hard.
He was a tough competitor. I mean, trying to pass Fred DeSarro, it was a tough pass. He drove clean. I mean, he's not going to run you into the fence or give you a bad time in that regard. By golly, you better be on the gas and your car better be right if you're going to try to go by Freddie.
Just to show the kind of guy he was, you know, me personally, somebody win too much or Yankees win too much, I hate him. I never hated Freddie for any reason. Could not win enough. And Bugsy, you had to love Bugsy. You couldn't dislike him.
The amazing thing is, everybody thought that there was this big feud between Freddie and Bugsy and Lenny and the whole thing over the breakup in '71.
It was always kind of tagged as a rivalry, partly because Bugsy'd been the national champ 3 years in a row, and then Freddie was the national champ. So to have the last 4 years of champions all of a sudden swap rides at the very beginning of next year, I think threw a lot of people.
You got to remember, this was in the 70s, the early 70s, and that's when all of a sudden the media was picking up in the sport. That's when all of a sudden all the newspapers started covering the short tracks. So we were all looking for stories all the time. There's, you know, the old adage, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Well, this looked like a tremendous rivalry.
Everybody thought we were bitter enemies and discuss. That was bullshit.
If you were in the grandstands, you know, you'd say, oh, Bugsy's in Freddie's old car, Freddie's in Bugsy's old car, and it'd be a big natural thing to think that they hated each other, but they were good pals, really good pals for years.
Freddie and Bugsy were really, really good friends.
There was never any bad blood between the two of them.
They really got along good together.
But for entertainment purposes, it was right. It was good.
Freddie had Bugsy out on his boat, his sailboat, which is his pride and joy, his passion, and you know, that's just the type of guy that Freddie was.
Bugsy told me, you know, he'd come by the scrapyard and he'd bring them Heinekens, and we'd polish off them Heinekens. Smoke some, we got him smoking cigars.
We bring a case of Heinekens once a month down here, right from work, all dressed up. Yeah, it was just, we were compatible all the time.
He would go to the yard up there and he'd talk about driving and setup and stuff like that. Bugsy would tell me. You know,
there was some real good racing. I mean, and they never so much as put each other out or even tried to. They just outraced each other.
That's what the people wanted to see. They came to see Fred and Bugs.
The rivalry had a lot to do with auto racing's coming up at that point. You know, both these guys were in the spotlight. Both of these guys were helping media give them something to write about. That swap played a major, major part in the uprising that the modifieds had in the 70s.
It was quite a situation with him and Bugsy, and there was enormous overt competition between them.
And of course the Trenton race where Freddie beat him by a foot.
Many people think that one of the finest races ever was Trenton in 1974.
The 1974 Race of Champions at Trenton has been one of those races that's lived forever in the folklore of modified racing. A lot of it is because Bugsy and Freddie went at it for the win.
And then that's when Trenton was 1.5 miles. It was a right-hand turn going down the backstretch to get out, and then they went out and made a big sweeping turn. And the third and fourth turn were highly banked.
The rivalry again. Are they rivals? Are they not? Freddie was obviously driving for Lenny. Bugsy was still with Casella. Sonny had fantastic top-shelf race cars. Lenny did too, but they were just seen as being more of a budget team than the Casella team was. It was the perfect head-to-head battle for that win because it was Bugsy and Freddie, BOEHLER, Casella, and that whole atmosphere of the little guy beating the bigger guy. As the laps were winding down, Freddie was leading, Bugsy was second, waiting to try the slingshot on the last lap.
They came off the fourth turn, wheel to wheel, wide open.
He beat him by about 18 inches.
It was a great race. Great race. I wasn't sure who won.
I mean, he didn't win by a hell of a lot.
Like a foot ahead of Bugsy at the finish.
People were jumping up and down, I mean, really going ballistic.
I was there that day, and I'll tell you what, the crowd was electric. The moment was electric. Everybody knew that these were the two rivals, and here we were in the biggest racetrack they're going to run on all year long, and for all the marbles. It was just a great race.
It was just an incredible finish.
He and Bugsy put on the show to end all shows.
You know, after the race, I can remember them both celebrating.
Everybody talks as if they were blood and guts rivals, but the first non-member of the BOEHLER crew that you can see in that victory lane shot is Bugsy. Reaching out, he's wearing a leather jacket. It was cold there that day. He's reaching out to shake Freddie's hand.
I was very happy for him.
That photo was kind of all you needed to see how much Bugsy thought of Freddie. You got to remember, Bugsy never won the Race of Champions. By then, he'd run it several times. It was probably the only thing in the sport he hadn't won. So for him to be the first guy over to congratulate the guy that beat him by a foot, you know, he had to think a lot of the guy. In the early 70s, Thompson, it seemed like the Honigs were trying to figure out what the right combination was to do. And they ended up running a small block program on Sunday evenings.
They were afternoon shows. That's why they call them twilight. So they were 2 o'clock shows, and they would be over before the sun set in the summertime. There were a ton of race cars in garages. And, you know, the brilliant concept was let everybody and anybody come with a safe race car and go racing. Thompson Speedway was the original super speedway of the North. There is no question about it.
Thompson in the 70s was a bit rustic. Always was just about my favorite track in New England. I mean, it was the fastest track until we got Loudon here.
Thompson was very, very quick.
The turns were quite tight. It's a very high bank. There were dirt piles all the way around it other than in front of the grandstand. The grandstand always had a fence in front of it.
It didn't have the guardrails that other tracks did. It had a sandbank.
Thompson back then, they had the sandbanks there. I really thought it was a lot safer to race there like that, but a lot of guys that hit the sandbanks come off and just keep on going.
You know, I can count dozens and dozens of race cars hitting the sand. You drag them out, you blow them off, and they can run again.
Many people said they'd rather hit them than the cement wall.
The sandbanks ate up cars a lot, but I think they did less damage than the cement walls.
Those dirt piles were very magnetic, shall we say. They tended to suck cars in once you get up there. I got into that dirt pile myself one time, and I remember trying to steer down and couldn't understand why the car wouldn't respond.
The car counts were pretty good because you had all the Friday and Saturday night tracks. A few drivers from every track would come there to race because they all could run there with their small blocks.
Those cars in those days, they were still backyard type built race cars.
Yeah, that small block division really went over well too. We always had a good field of cars.
Yeah, there was nothing in those days to have 40, 50, 60 cars show up to race in those races. And the cars were all different.
Any motor, no weight rule.
You had Dick Casso with a cut down Corvair body car.
Dick Dunn, Bob Potter, and Dick Casso. Guys like that were kind of the early hot shoes in that small block program at Thompson. Those guys kind of ruled that place for a little while. None of the top guys really came, but nobody else was running Sundays then. So Freddie and Lenny started going over there on Sunday. They put a small block together, not a big dollar small block by any means, and they started running there.
I'd say the pinnacle of Lenny and Freddie's dominance came during that small block era on Sunday nights.
74 season was actually Lenny's first full year bringing the coupe to the small block races at Thompson.
He was winning several in a row. Every week he was winning. It got to the point they even started him from the rear, figuring to slow him down a little bit. And he still won. So yeah, they finally put a bounty to see if anybody could beat him.
They had 18 races that year. Freddie won 14 of the 18. Leo won 1, and Freddie had a DNF in 3 of the others, 2 flat tires and a blown fuel pump.
Back in the 70s, Fred and BOEHLER, that combination, you would always bet who's going to finish second. They were just unbeatable.
And I guess he just had some unbelievable moves, particularly down in the inside, and he was literally unbeatable.
When you pictured Freddie, you pictured his patented high-low move. He would do it in 3 and 4, but he'd especially do it in turn 1, where he'd follow that guy in, and even if that guy was high, Freddie was half a car higher, and then he would cut down right in the center of the corner. He'd turn it down and just rock it off the bottom, and almost inevitably it was a position.
I would get to the track, and Clyde McLeod, who was crew chief for Eddie Flemke's teams, he'd go, "Jack, you got that lawnmower blade sharpened up?" Because Freddie's style was, he was basically down on the infield at the beginning of the race, and he would pass anywhere from 5 to 10 cars in the first lap.
They absolutely dominated there.
And they were extremely successful.
When Lenny and Freddie went over there, they started running up front right away and won a lot of races. And I think that turned a lot of eyes toward that. You know, Freddie was a national name, a huge regional name, and he was going to be there every week, so why not watch it?
And then you had Dick Armstrong with a state-of-the-art car with Jeff Bodine in it.
When Jeff Bodine started driving for Dick Armstrong, Dick's image was exactly the opposite of Lenny's. You know, Dick owned a jewelry company. He liked his stuff to look good and bright and clean. Jeff was also an outsider. Freddie had become sort of like Thompson's hometown hero. By then he'd already won a couple of track championships there. It was a rivalry, it created itself. Low dollar BOEHLER versus big dollar Dick Armstrong. Local guy Freddie versus outsider Jeff Bodine. And the two of them, through 1976 and 77 especially, were far and away the guys to beat. I mean, Ronnie had some great days and nights there with Billy Hood's black number 7, which became the M&H Tire number 7. Bugsy ran really well with Joe Brady's Pintos, but the guys to beat week in and week out were Bodine and DeSarro, and that was cool because that's where your eyes wanted to go.
He won championships in 74, 75, 76, and 77.
His dad was his biggest race fan, one of the nicest guys in the sport of racing ever.
His father was really a good guy.
Pop was such a likable guy. He just couldn't help but, you know, want to be around him.
And what a great guy.
He was such a nice guy. Everybody loved him.
I used to go every Thursday night. I'd go down there and have supper with him. And I'll tell you, that guy could cook. He loved to cook. When he'd make a sausage grinder, I mean, the sausage was outstanding, but you grab a hold of it, the grease would run out of that thing, and if you didn't have something on, you get it all over your pants and everything else. But I mean, he was a character, really a character.
When I started going to the races, 1976, Mike Ediscavage would bring me, and he would always tell me, sit by the DeSarros, because everybody knew where the DeSarros sat at Thompson, same place every week. The DeSarros were a big presence, in my mind, particularly at Thompson. I know they went to other racetracks, but at Thompson, because they always sat in that one spot, you know, you'd walk by the front of that grandstand and there they were. And Pop was such a beloved figure.
His parents were 100% behind him. Helen didn't come as often, but she came as often as she felt and could. Pops, he was pretty much there all the time.
I don't believe he ever missed a race.
I think Pops felt he was doing something he would love to do himself and couldn't, so he was doing it through Fred.
Pops was the man at the racetrack. Ladies' man, I guess. He was getting kisses from his women everywhere we went.
And his scope bottle.
His old bottle of scope.
Pop would carry around a little flask of a mysterious green fluid.
Of course, it was cream de mint and 3/4 vodka, but everybody wanted a little mouthwash. I don't care if it was Trenton, Norwood, Waterford, Thompson, Martinsville, Virginia, Florida. Everybody knew Pops and his mouthwash.
There's no drinking in the pit area, but nobody was gonna get mad at Pop DeSarro for carrying around his little flask. It was just, that was part of who he was.
He was quite the photographer. I mean, he had his dark room in the cellar, and he developed his own pictures. And
oh yeah, he always had a camera with him. Always had a camera with him.
He would bring his big one in the beginning, but then they started making them smaller, so then he had the sneak attack. He'd pull his little one out.
I think he knew somebody probably on every crew, in every division, anywhere Freddie raced. Just watching Pop work his way through the pits at Stafford or Thompson or Waterford or Seekonk or anywhere was fun because he'd stop and talk to everybody.
Pops was cool, period. I had a good relationship with him. You know, we just talk about in-laws. He was the best.
Freddie DeSarro was a working man's race car driver. You know, you come, you drive the race car, you park it, and you go home.
Never lost his focus. No matter what he raced, whether it be a modified at 150 miles an hour or a sailboat at 5 or 6 knots.
Freddie DeSarro was an incredible sailor.
If he wasn't racing on Sunday afternoon, he'd be out sailing off Block Island being as happy going 2 miles an hour as 120.
He was always intense and always wanted to win. He never lost his will to win.
He got the kids onto skateboards.
He seen the kids riding the skateboard. Came home and he gives me the skateboard. I go, what do you want me to do with this? He goes, I don't know, I seen the kids doing it. Looked like fun. Figure it out.
We had started to petition it off to finish off the basement. And on one side was like a doorway opening. And they would run laps down in the cellar.
So my dad came down there one night. He said, hey, let me try this. Let me try this. It doesn't look that hard. She's yelling, Fred, you're going to kill yourself. You got to work tomorrow.
He was going to give his hand at it, figuring he could do it too. We weren't going to outbest him.
And he made it around almost. He almost made a lap.
I was upstairs, and I heard a cut thumb. And I said, oh no, somebody's hurt.
And he landed on his back, and it was, Linda.
And I came downstairs, and Fred's flat on his back.
That was the last time he got on one. He did it one time, and that was it.
Thankfully, it was okay, but the kids were thrilled because they felt they beat their father or something.
A lot of people to this day link Freddie with Thompson because he was so fast there. And his last NASCAR track championship would have been at Stafford in '76.
He painted that car purposely red, white, and blue. And that was what basically everybody called the Bicentennial Vega. And we ended up winning the Stafford championship that year.
So some of the folks that knew him only from a distance might see him as a half-mile specialist, you know. But he won at every bull ring you can think of. He won at Seekonk. He won at Albany, Saratoga in New York. Won at Utica, Rome in New York. Islip Speedway on Long Island. And the thing you got to remember, he was only at those races because they were either double pointers or extra point, you know, national championship shows. So he was taking on the best in the biggest races at their tracks, and he was winning. On the other end of the scale, you know, he had a couple of great showings in sportsman cars at Daytona, late model sportsman, which became the Busch Series, the Xfinity Series. There wasn't a track where Freddie was ever at a disadvantage, and you couldn't say that about everybody. There were guys that didn't like fast places. There were guys that weren't good on the bull rings. Freddie, no matter where you brought him, he was fantastic.
Freddie was good no matter what he drove.
Freddie really, really liked to race. There's no doubt about it. On a Sunday afternoon, if he wasn't doing anything, he'd show up at this funky little dirt track called Lakeville Speedway, and he'd just bang around out there just for fun.
He said, well, now we're going dirt racing, and that was Orange County Speedway in Middletown, New York. We walked in, and you would have thought that I was with Elvis Presley. He was signing autographs. They were all around him, and I was like, holy cow, I never experienced anything like this. So anyway, we're going to run the heat race. Well, we're all qualified because he's Fred DeSarro. He walks over to me and he hands me $200. And I said, what's this for? He said, front money. I said, front money? I never heard of front money. But then again, I'm not Fred DeSarro. And so anyway, he said, yeah, I got $400 to show up. You get 2, and I'll take 2. He didn't even have to tell me about it and kept the 4, but he didn't because that's the way he was.
Freddie was fantastic at figuring tracks out in a hurry. And if it was a track that he'd never been to before, he was fine with that. The best example I can think of is the first World Series of asphalt racing at New Smyrna, Florida, in February in conjunction with Speed Weeks at Daytona. Was in 1977. They had run for years with late models, which are huge down there anyway.
That was the first year that we had gone to race at Smyrna. Yeah, we used to always go over there and watch the races. Running the modified at Daytona in 75 and 76, we didn't race the modified at Smyrna. And this year, we brought the modified down.
The first year the modifieds were there was 1977, and the first winner was Freddie DeSarro in a BOEHLER Vega. And I mean, it was Ritchie and Maynard and Flemke and, you know, the usual all-star troupe that turned out at New Smyrna back then.
Freddie's first time on that racetrack, and he won the race. He beat Ritchie.
In '78, they had gone down to New Smyrna racing, and we had the blizzard. Well, they got out just before the blizzard got really bad. Of course, we still had lots of snow when they got back. Fred's watched the kids come down from the hillside across the street from the house, go across the road and down into our yard, which kind of went a little bit low the road level, but he just thought it was a great idea to build like a snow ramp, that like a ski jump that they could just fly off of. And that's his idea of fun. So the kids loved it. All the neighborhood kids did.
Freddie had won everywhere, but in the last several years of his life, he wasn't racing as often as he had in the past for professional reasons. Lenny had had some health problems.
Lenny was real sick because he had lymphoma. And he was getting worse and worse, and they were both of them were backing down.
Freddie was working at Bostitch and was had a higher ranking position and could get away less than he had.
Freddie had moved into a management position at Bostitch, and they had spent a lot of money on him, training him and whatever, and he was starting to move up the food chain there, and they didn't want him out there racing cars and getting hurt.
They were cutting their racing back. Thompson was probably always going to be their regular track.
The day of the accident it started out like any other day. Nothing any different. Charlie and Fred got out and went in the pit. I watched them walk in. Nothing any different.
It's just like any other Sunday. Went through the pits as always. It's all right. See you after the race. I'll see you after the race, Dad. I gave him a hug and kiss.
Usually I drive walk. That day I sat there and watched them walk in. Went and parked the car. We went in. The kids did their thing.
We got in. We were up in the stands for a little bit. The cars were practicing.
We were practicing. So I was on a flag stand, and I looked up, and they were coming down the backstretch, wide open down there.
Remember being behind Freddie, not unusual. It was the new car, 2x3 chassis. I was probably at least 20 car lengths behind, nowhere near the speed. And I watched the left front go up in smoke.
And I was turned around because we were always doing something in the stands. But I caught my eye that just saw the tail end of the car. I said, somebody went over the wall. So we took off running. We'd always go chase down whatever, racetrack rats.
I was talking to acquaintances when somebody finally said that a car went over the bank, and then they said it was Fred. And at first, oh yeah, but he'd be all right.
And the car just climbed up, over, and down.
All I can remember is him going over the sandbank, going up through the trees and straight down.
Just went straight in, and number 3 went up, over, and out of the place. So right then, I threw the red flag.
So I get there, I have no problem at all stopping between 3 and 4, and as I'm getting out of the car, and really not hurrying, not thinking it's that serious, I see Bugsy just doing donuts in the infield. He had to have been just ahead of Freddie. I was like, what's he so revved up about? I got to the car and Bugsy was already there.
Because I was the first one and I jumped over the wall, and then Kenny Bouchard came.
Kenny Bouchard was the first one that stopped, and when he ran over and he ran down, I mean, he basically ripped the top of that car off with his bare hands.
Ken Bouchard, he was probably the spokesman telling us what to do.
I was there trying to get his strap underneath his helmet to get his helmet off.
You know, we all had a job to do, I thought. Nothing I want to do again. I can remember Bugsy was just, somebody almost had to take him aside.
I really panicked. It broke my heart.
It was just gruesome. It was bad. There was hope. He was alive.
I mean, other people are going over there. Bugsy went over there one time. Don McTavish hit a tree when skyrocketed off and hit a tree. And I mean, they walked away from it. So I mean, they just figured, they were waiting for him to come running up the top of the sandbank.
And sometimes these things would happen. Cars would go up on the sandbanks, and you'd see them kind of crest the top of the sandbanks, and the sandbank, just like on a road course, it would bog them down and hold them there. Well, we were on the quarter midget just down in the hole, and you'd look up and you'd see a car and everybody be, oh wow, look at that, and so forth. Then they'd bring out the bucket loader and pull it back, and everything was fine. But on this particular day, it wasn't like that.
I basically held his head and neck there, and seemed forever for the track crew, no fault of theirs. They had to come through pit area and out around by the clubhouse to get to where we were.
I ran down as far as I could on the end of the grandstand.
I got all the way around out there. My brother was not far behind me. And when it seemed what was left of the car, it was just wreckage. It was like, and Bugsy come out of it and grabbed us and said, "You don't want to go over there. You don't want to go over there. You don't want to see any of that."
First person I saw came back from the accident was Bugsy. And he couldn't talk to me. So I knew it was bad.
You know, I was probably in shock too. Freddie and I that close. I hate to see, I love to have competition. I hate to see him get hurt.
I was a little late getting to the races that day. It just happened to be one of those commutes from Cape Cod. And just as I was getting there, the ambulance was leaving.
I got to the track and one of the crew guys, he said, that's your driver in the ambulance. The ambulance was just pulling out and I was at the sign-in shack. And I looked and I could tell it was serious. It was the saddest day of my life up to that point.
That was one of the era there when the cars were so stiff that the drivers were taking all the impact.
It was a terrible day, terrible.
My heart still pounds when I think about it.
It just seems so odd to me, so stunning, as that Freddie knew every inch of Thompson. He could go high, he could go low, it didn't matter. And then just to watch him drive off over the sandbank, it just knew something was wrong. It just didn't seem right, still don't seem right.
I couldn't believe that the master of that racetrack could be seriously hurt at it.
You just didn't think Freddie at Thompson?
It was one of those things where it just seemed surreal. There's got to be something wrong with that. Freddie couldn't get hurt. There's no way Fred DeSarro is going to get hurt. Can't be Freddie. It's got to be somebody else.
I remember walking in and talking to some people and what's going on, who's running fast. And a couple of people who had been around racing for a long time said, boy, Freddie had a hell of a crash.
I had no details. I talked to some of the crew members, but everybody was pretty sad at the time and not talking too much either.
Always pitted right next to him, and he was right there by my car. And how bad is it? And I said, putting him in the ambulance, to get him to the hospital, he'll be good. And that was my thought. Once you're to the hospital, you're good.
I remember looking in the car and just the amount of blood that was on the floor pan, and you knew that it had to be serious to have lost that much blood.
I remember Bugsy walking back through the pits with one arm of his uniform red from blood. And, all of a sudden you start to put two and two together that this was a bad crash.
The rest of the day actually is a blank to me. I don't remember the rest of the day.
I believe there was a driver's meeting. Do you want to race or whatever? And I raced, but what happened, I have no idea. I was in a trance.
Do you remember there being any talk about to not race or continue race or no?
No, because nobody knew how bad Freddie was. They put him in the ambulance and they went to the hospital, which happens, somebody gets hurt, they put him in the ambulance and check him out. So nobody really knew then how bad Freddie was. So that's why they just continued racing.
Again, a lot of people left the track that day not knowing how badly Freddie was hurt. If you were in the pits, you kind of knew, but if you weren't, you might not know.
Carl Merrill said I could go in the ambulance with him, and he would take care of the boys. Not to worry about it. They'll take care of the boys. Go with Fred. I just knew it wasn't just a sore toe this time. And they took us up to the hospital there in Connecticut.
They had him in there, he's in there for a while, and they're going in and out of the room, in and out of the room.
They were there for a while making their assessments, and it was that he needed more specialized care.
They said, we gotta go to Providence. Can't treat it here. So we went to Providence.
Pops and Helen was with us, and the boys, and all I could pray, because I didn't know what the procedures were or what would happen if something should happen between there and Rhode Island with the ambulance. And all I kept hearing was, don't shut off the siren, don't shut off the siren. Because I felt if we did, it was not good. Fortunately, I had a good friend that worked for an orthopedic doctor there, and I called her and told her what had happened. And I told her I needed a good doctor. Fred was hurt bad, and she took care of everything. She got in touch with him, and they were there ready and waiting for us when we got there.
Later on that night, myself and Bob Ross, the guy that had the bounty hunter, we went to Providence, to the hospital. And, we were in the waiting room and stuff there, and Fred, the old man Fred, took me in to see young Fred. And he was just laying there, and I touched his hand. It was cold as ice. So he was on life support.
We left Thompson that night, and I went right to the hospital to see him. I didn't think he'd make it that night. He had tubes and everything. Oh, Jesus. It was sad. Very sad.
Just remember going in and saying, he's going to be okay, he's going to be okay, he's going to be okay. Trying to convince myself, I think, that, things are good.
And I really, really remember riding in the car, of course, and good old Charlie again.
Talk about loyalty of friends. While Fred was in the hospital, this Charlie Main, who used to drive, he was the driver, drove us around to all these races. He took a month off, and he drove Linda to Providence every day while he was still alive in the hospital. Every day.
Charlie was there supporting me quietly, patiently, tended to my needs of getting back and forth to see Fred.
Bill Sloboda and I had made 3 or 4 trips to Rhode Island, to the Rhode Island Hospital. After that, we came down here to Lenny's shop to visit Lenny, because Lenny had been sick for a year. He was private. We all knew.
You could see from his condition. He was in sad shape.
And he was grieving. Not only being sick, but you could tell he was in anguish.
Like I said, people came to the house to inquire how he was doing.
Me, always about work. I had a load going to North Stonington, Connecticut, and I went back empty with the rig through this housing development, I want to say, through a very residential neighborhood. Knocked on the door and just asked how things were going, and that's when I knew that it was pretty much over.
Then after a month's time, the doctor just told Linda, you got to make a decision.
Had to make a decision. She had to make a big decision. It was either a vegetable, and I might not have been able to make it, or that wasn't how I wanted to see my dad.
And she's the one that made the decision.
Probably due to the infection that went through his body. If he was able to fight that infection off, how much other damage it may have done, we'll never know. Plus, it was on the left side, which the left side is a lot of memory. And I had this awful fear that he wouldn't remember the kids. I didn't know how much memory was going to be wiped out, how far back. A month or two? Years? A couple years? How much was going to be gone? It was scary.
The end result was it was a basal skull fracture, which is the same thing happened to Dale Earnhardt. Now, if the Hans device would have been in the mix of things at the time, maybe he'd be sitting here talking to us today. You don't know.
After that, just life wasn't the same. A lot of figuring out on your own.
It was just basically like Superman dying, and because he was my Superman, watching him and hanging around with him, and I think he was that way to a lot of people, not just me.
It was a huge loss for everybody.
It kind of carved a bit of the heart out of anybody that loved automobile racing and the people that do it well. It was held at a huge church. The church wasn't big enough. It was certainly one of the biggest crowds I have ever seen at a funeral.
It was a good 3.5, 4 hours.
We waited like 4 hours to get in and see him.
I mean, the line encircled the funeral home.
Freddie had a lot of fans. A lot of people really liked him. I don't know anybody who disliked Freddie DeSarro.
The guy that did the eulogy was a friend of his too, by the name of Bill Drury, and he's passed away too. But I will always remember the way he ended up his eulogy. And he took it and he put the book down and he looked out and he said, "Fred is gone, but he will live in our hearts forever." And the whole place went silent. And I mean, that sticks with me to this day. I'll never forget that. After they had the burial and everything, everybody went to Linda's house. You know, everything was going along, but then all of a sudden there was wondering, where the hell is Bugsy? They couldn't find him. Couldn't find him. Well, somebody went out looking for him, and they found him. He was down in the woods with the two kids, sitting on a log, crying their eyes out. Just him with the two kids.
Gary is a crazy sucker. I love him.
Bugsy, I love that man.
Brian is very quiet. And just two opposites. But they were like family.
You don't look at racing the same. I think there's a lot of people that look at racing when they lost Dale Earnhardt the same way. It'll never be the same. And modified racing never was the same after Fred passed.
Thompson arranged to have a benefit race on November 5th, a Sunday.
They wanted to have an event just to help the family. I mean, he wasn't going to be able to work, obviously, for a long time. Don Hoenick was pretty much the prime organizer of this.
You know, November 1st, Freddie passed away, and the race transitioned immediately from being a benefit race to defray medical bills. And now it was a memorial race / benefit race.
I couldn't go to the memorial race. I knew I would not be able to handle it all emotionally. I couldn't face that, and there's no way I don't know what you want to call it, but I didn't want to break down and not take away from what it was and what it was for, that it was for Fred.
Probably the largest attended event in the history of Thompson Speedway.
I don't think I've ever seen the stands that full at Thompson ever since that. It was packed.
Never see so many people at one track.
That race felt fuller than any event I've ever been at, because it wasn't just sold out, it was, you know, you're right up next to your buddy.
It was standing room only.
The place was packed. There wasn't a seat to be had.
It was amazing. The place was just mobbed.
The competitors worked for free. The employees worked for free. But the regular prices were charged, and there was a lot of money being passed in donations flying around that day.
My wife got deeply involved in it, and they sold tickets at the gate And the funny thing about that was people would come up for a $10 ticket and they'd give her $100. And they would say, no, we don't want the ticket. Yeah.
It was like a donation, you know, whatever you want to pay. So there were guys peeling off $100 bills. There were guys peeling off $20 bills. You know, I was a kid, I might have had $20 or whatever it was.
All of the money went to the DeSarro family.
It was amazing, the amount of love that was showed at that race.
They signed everybody that went into the pit. I mean, they had a lot of cars that showed up. I guess cars that really didn't even normally would even run at this track that came, and they all, of course, had to sign into the pits like you do any week when you're going to run a race. And they gave us that book too, with all the signatures of everybody that came. And it's amazing just to see all those people that wanted to pay homage to Fred and respect him.
And it became important for everybody to be there. Guys from all over the Northeast were there.
Every kind of race car, no to bad, wanted to be there. They were running wings, they could do what you wanted in that race, and a few cars had the wings.
Well, our day didn't start off well. I'm pretty sure it was Jimmy Spencer. Took like 4 of us out first turn. I guess we got it back together for the Consi, not even competitive. And then they had so many cars that they ran a B main, if that's what you want to call it. Gonna take one car out of it or something, and I was fortunate enough to win that. To me, it was one I'll never forget. Probably my favorite win.
There was this amazing incident that the pole on that race was left open and Bugsy was on the outside pole.
Something happened to the car and he didn't crash. Something broke.
Bugsy was on the pole. I remember they were getting a 3 and the left front just took a turn and moved, dropped down.
Bugsy pulled around and pulled into the pits, and he had broken a ball joint.
Right front ball joint broke or something on the right front. Boom.
He was out of it, and that was kind of ominous.
Now you stop and think. Bugsy had been practicing with Freddie on the day of Freddie's crash. They're super tight as friends, and at almost the same spot on the backstretch where it became evident that Freddie wasn't going to make the third corner, here we are weeks later in his memorial race, and Bugsy's car fails at the same spot, and you could not get out of your head just the mystery involved in that.
Bugsy saw it almost as some kind of strange spiritual event.
And Bugsy got out of the car, and I guess he was crying like a baby. He says, Freddie's trying to give me a message.
Never enough to make you really wonder, is there somebody up there looking at me or what? I can't explain it. The Lord must have done something.
We were all anxious to go racing, and they're working on Bugsy's car.
Bugsy, they ended up asking him to be the honorary starter for the race.
Next thing I know, Bugsy is the flag man. There was that much time went by, but they made it happen.
They put him up on the starter stand with Bugsy, and Bugsy let him wait, drop the green.
Oh yeah, they put me in a starter stand. That took a little pressure off my brain.
Everybody still talks about the last lap.
Jeff Bodine was leading it.
He took the white flag leading. They went through turn 1. They all went down the backstretch. And I gotta say, they did a masterful job of coordinating this with the drivers, because I know guys that worked on pit crews that weren't aware this was gonna happen.
Oh, we talked it over with the drivers before we did it.
It was indoctrinated into us that nobody is to take the check.
Came off the 4th turn, slowed down and went in the pit area, and everybody in the infield pits, and everybody followed him.
And the pit road at Thompson back then used to be the little infield oval, quarter-mile oval where the street stocks and some other classes used to run. You saw Jeff turn into the infield, and every car followed him into the infield.
And everybody went down pit road.
They all just pulled into the infield and shut their cars off.
And then I waved the checkered flag like Freddie won the race.
There was stunned silence.
You could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet.
Nobody said a word.
It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen.
The last lap was Fred's lap, but that's hard not to forget.
There's some fantastic photos taken after the race in Victory Lane of all the drivers kneeling and standing, kind of splayed out in two directions.
It was really something. You know, they brought the clock out.
And right in the center of the photo is Bugsy with the two kids.
And then Bugsy came and gave us big hugs. That guy.
And I remember Bugsy looking devastated, and yet in that picture, he's the guy with his hands on the kids' shoulders.
You get emotional when you're close to somebody like that.
You know, you don't know how to act when you're at a benefit race for the father of these two young boys. But, you know, Bugsy was probably pinching their ear or messing their hair up, you know, trying to keep it as light as he could.
He said, "Don't worry about anything, everything will be fine." You know, everybody clapped and everybody said, you know, your dad was a hell of a driver.
I don't know that I've ever been at a racetrack that had a combination of so many emotions. It wasn't the kind of memorial race where you were so mad or depressed or anything that you wouldn't want to be there. It was important to be there.
It wasn't dread or anything. It was just, I call it love, that people, the racers got together and said, we're going to do this thing.
I know when they had the benefit for Freddie, Lenny wasn't able to attend. He watched it from the clubhouse hill, had to stay in the car and everything. He was going through chemo and he was very weak. He rebounded after that.
Leo Cleary, him and Lenny were fairly friendly. Well, Leo went up and built a new car for Lenny and put a body on it, the first Chevette. And you could tell, I mean, this thing was a looker. Had a beautiful paint, you know, had the BOEHLER colors on it and everything else, but it was a looker. I mean, Leo was an ace body man. So Leo drove the car, Lenny's car, the following year to the championship at Seekonk, which I think was pretty apropos.
Sometime after, it was a few years later, I had all these trophies and I was looking at making a move, and I said, we can't keep all these. I can't move all these. They need to go somewhere, and what struck me was to share them with people who cared for Fred.
Linda got a hold of me and said, look, you're an independent car owner, you really never had anybody helping you. She said, and that's how Fred was. And I want you to have his trophies when he was an independent.
So I went through a lot of the letters that I kept them all. I still have them. People that took time to write a note, express their feelings for Fred, I thought then they would like to have one. So I wrote them a letter and told them I would be at one of the tracks. They could take their pick. I had loaded a bunch of trophies in the back of the car and pick out whatever one struck their fancy. And lo and behold, they did. They came. I went home with an empty trunk. And, you know, again, too, that is so touching that somebody wanted it. It was a piece of something to hang on to. And I understand that.
Pop used to come here at the garage and help me out all the time, and he was good friends with my dad. Pop said to me one day, he says, I want to go back to Thompson. And I said, really? And I didn't even go back to Thompson after that benefit race. Just couldn't get my mind wrapped around it. He said, would you mind taking me back there? And I take a deep breath and I was like, oof, okay, I will do whatever you want. So we're driving up and I said, listen, if you're uncomfortable, I said, we'll turn right around. Whatever you want to do, we'll do. And so he says, no, let's go. So we get in the parking lot and we're walking in, and all of a sudden everybody saw him and we're coming in the gate, and oh my God, they were just, you know, Pop was a real special guy. He was very special, and the people just absolutely loved him. And on his own merit, I kind of got over the side. I said, you okay with this? I said, you want to go home? No, I'm good, we'll stay. so we did stay for a while. And I don't think we watched the races or anything, but he just wanted to, you know, get back in a little bit. But I thought it so special that he allowed me to be the guy that took him back.
I have a bowling ball that I've carried around. Seems like forever. It's older than I am, but I could still see D-E-A-C, Deke. So I asked my mom, Deke. Well, that was his CV handle, the Deacon. His brothers called him the Deacon. He was the only one that was an altar boy and went to church. So when my youngest son was born, let's call him Deacon. So we named him the Deacon.
I'll tell you a story about Freddie in the first near Hall of Fame ballot. He missed by 1 vote being in the first class. I remember counting votes, and I couldn't believe it.
It ended up Freddie's induction subsequently was kicked to the second year.
And then the next year, the second year, he was clearly the top vote getter.
They contacted me because they knew that I was friendly with him anyway. And Linda couldn't come, so I think it was Linda's idea that Bugsy accepted.
Hard to describe. I was very emotional about that, but I was very proud to do that. You know, what can I tell you? We were good friends.
Obviously in Stafford's list of 50 greatest Stafford drivers, if that list was only 5 or 10, he'd be on that list. He'd have to be on that list.
Freddie was as good, in my book, as good as any of them guys.
He's there with Richie Evans.
There's a lot of good guys, but he was one of the top, I'd say top 5.
Somewhere in the top 3 or no less than top 5, somewhere in that range, top 3, which would be ironic.
Mike BOEHLER, we've always been friends ever since. He calls me up and said, hey, how do you feel about driving Old Blue? I said, yeah, right. He says, yeah, I got you the car, Stafford, 40th anniversary. We won the first one, they wanted to do something big for the 40th. So we flew up, met the Pro 9 guy, and he said, she's ready. We just gassed her up. So got in and I drove out, and I remember to pull out onto the racetrack with the car. I was like, oh my God, I'm actually on the track. I just wanted to go. She sounded so good for as old as it was. The big bus steering wheel. That was cool. That was the best day of my life, to drive that car. That was a good feeling.
Shortly after Fred passed, I found an article that I came across in a paper, and as I read it, it just kind of had a meaning to me as to his life. And it's by Lily Palmer, who was an actress of years ago, and it's titled, Lily's Ready After Living Her 100 Lives. I don't want to live to be very old. The only thing that even matters is that when all is said and done, and the cross is over your grave, whether you are 20 or 30 or 70, there's someone standing in front of it can say, that person has lived, has missed none of the major joys, and I suppose none of the major sorrows. And if he has lain in the arms of a woman he loved and who loved him, so many people don't. And if you're lucky enough to be successful in whatever you are doing, taste success and taste failure so that the opposites complement each other. If you had lots of friends, if you have had a child, it all belongs to life. And if all that has happened, thank God, it was wonderful. That's life, and love it. It doesn't have to be a long one. And just reading this, because of Fred losing him so young, and I think back on it, that he lived a full life. He did the things he wanted. He did the things he loved. He had the people that he loved and loved him. And he lived a full life.
For a majority of the first part of your interview, you talk about Fred in the present tense.
Yeah. No, I truly never let go of him. I found through all this in reading things and that as much as they showed respect, and I know that they all respected him, but it wasn't just respecting him for being a racer and being a competitor along with them. They respected him as a person. How he treated other people, how he helped other people out, giving advice and things.
You catch me without no earplugs in and stuff. I get these from work, they're free, and I do not want you in the car without them. His home hearing was going away on him. And he said, you need to wear earplugs. They sound funny. Get used to it, that's what you're doing. And he was just like a real father to me, as was Lenny.
I was divorced, and he knew I had the 4 kids. And he used to tell me, Jack, whatever you do, don't ever forget your kids. That's how much of a family man he was.
He would do anything for his family. They came for us.
A family man? A caring person?
Someone that I would think be worthy of bringing up my children.
And I also found in the papers that wrote about it all afterwards was a little tiny article that Clint put in. He had built a certain friendship with Fred over the years. And ironically that he watched Fred get in the car and Fred gave his typical wave, how you doing and whatever. He drove off out to the practice run on the car. I feel like Clint was the last person who really saw him off.
I remember walking between a couple of buildings and Fred DeSarro was walking the other way. And despite the fact that I had asked Fred probably a question or two, I really didn't feel like I knew the guy. You know, again, you're a 16-year-old kid. And the two of us were kind of in this little alley created by either a food stand or a truck or something in a men's room. Freddie was walking the other way, and I didn't glance at him, didn't do anything, because he was Fred DeSarro. And he reached out and kind of grabbed me by the sleeve as we were walking by. And that kind of stopped me, and I turned and looked at him. He said, hey kid, you're doing a great job in the paper. And to me, it was like, whoa. I mean, he was one of the Mount Rushmore guys at that time in New England. Made me feel like $1 million.
This was probably 76 or 77. It was Charlie Main, Fred, and I going to Martinsville. We were low on gas. So just outside the town of Martinsville, there was a gas station. Now this is Sunday night, probably 8:30 on a Sunday night. Of course, this station's not open. I says, look at Fred, we'll pull in here and we'll shake the gas out of the hoses and get us a little where might make us the Roanoke. We go to shake the gas and the pumps are on. So we pump the gas, we fill the car up with gas. I said, let's go. Fred says, no, we're paying for this. Well, the station was closed, of course. He took an envelope, wrote down how many gallons we had pumped, what the cost was, stuck money in that envelope and put it in the door slot at that gas station. You know, that's just the type of person Freddie was.